Napoleon Bonaparte stands before a gilded mirror in his private chambers, his face twisted with anger as he studies his own reflection. At roughly 5 feet 2 inches, he has to tiptoe to reach a crown placed deliberately on a high shelf. Outside, his generals wait, hearing his shouts in Italian, not French. The man who claimed to have conquered Europe, the strategist, the reformer, is having a childish meltdown over an English caricature that depicts him as a petulant dwarf. Burn every drawing. Arrest the artists, he bellows at his aides. The same man who spilled millions of lives to feed his ambition cannot tolerate a joke about his height. This is the private portrait of a small Corsican with a monumental inferiority complex to face history polished into a hero. The image of Napoleon taught in classrooms is tidy and comfortable. You learned it as a story of merit, a provincial boy who rose, by talent and will, from the chaos of the revolution to reshape Europe. He is the military genius of famous campaigns in Italy and Egypt. He is the lawgiver whose civil code modernized old legal systems. He is the man who brought order, efficiency, and, in many accounts, progress. Open a textbook and the scenes are cinematic and simple. A young officer earns promotion on merit. Victories follow in sequence. A brilliant administrator reorganizes the state. The code is written, the markets stabilize, bureaucracy becomes modern. Films give the story polish. Portraits present him heroic, hand tucked into his waistcoat, cape dramatically thrown back, face resolute and majestic. The tomb at Les Invalides has gravity. Tourists stand before it as if before an altar. The story comforts because it fits tidy narratives. Merit beats privilege. An individual can change history. Listen to the voices that built this version. School curricula frame him as the child of the revolution who completed its promise. Museum placards link reforms to Enlightenment ideals. Filmmakers and novelists find a tragic arc. A man of small origins achieves greatness and then falls. Together, these narratives make the complexity palatable. They erase the abrasion of inconvenient facts. They also create an emblem, Napoleon, the man who embodied the revolution and modernization. But that version is not the whole truth. It smooths over costs and contradictions. It wipes the slate clean of casualties, repressions, and reversals. It makes trade-offs invisible. It hides bargaining, opportunism, and the violence on which much of his rule depended. When you look closer, the seams show. Consider the military myths first. You heard of the brilliant Italian campaign, the tactical masterstroke at Austerlitz, the daring at Ulm. Those were real achievements. Yet military history is messy. Napoleon won important battles. He also lost many. He waged war across continents. He accepted casualties on a scale that modern readers should find shocking. Armies moved, but bodies piled up. The educational narrative often treats defeat as anomaly blamed on weather or coalitions. In classrooms, the Russian campaign becomes a tragic footnote. Winter and distance overwhelmed even the greatest commander. That explanation is partial at best. Look at the administrative and legal achievements. The Civil Code did rationalize certain civil laws. It standardized property rights, contract law, and family law in ways that would outlast regimes. Ministers and administrators built efficient tax systems, professionalized the military, and centralized governance. Those are tangible accomplishments and explain why remnants of Napoleonic administration survive in modern states. They also served as instruments of control. Centralization made it easier to levy troops, collect taxes, and suppress opposition. Reform and domination blended. There is a story of rescue in the myth. Napoleonic reforms saved France from chaos and exported a rational legal architecture across Europe. There is a darker story too. Some reforms were rolled back or adjusted when convenient. The proclaimed ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity did not always guide policy. In 1802, The regime reintroduced slavery in colonies where it had been abolished during the Revolution. That decision returned thousands of people to bondage. It is a fact not easily reconciled with the image of a liberator bringing enlightenment. The reintroduction reveals priorities. Empire, commerce, and the interests of colonists outweighed revolutionary rhetoric. Another theme is his nationality and cultural identity. Textbooks simplify him into a French national hero. His Corsican origins get footnotes at best. In reality, Napoleon was Corsican by birth, raised in an island culture that spoke Italian. He learned French later in life and retained an accent. For a man who would rule France, this outsider status mattered. It shaped perceptions about him and his own sense of being always under scrutiny. It also reveals how national myths can adopt and adapt a figure a foreign-born leader becomes by retelling a native savior. The personal side of the official story is often sentimentalized. The romance with Josephine is framed as tragic and noble. The portraits of courtly affection give the story warmth. Yet intimate records and private correspondence reveal a far more transactional reality. Marriages were political tools. Relationships with women could function as currency in a court of favors and influence. Public declarations of love coexisted with controlling behaviors, surveillance of spouses, and extramarital affairs. The myth silences these uncomfortable domestic calculations. You saw the image of the imperial court as magnificent, orderly, even glamorous. In those scenes, Napoleon's siblings appear crowned, ruling satellite states. The official version frames this as the outward sign of a new European order. In practice, nepotism was blatant. Brothers and sisters installed as monarchs often lacked the linguistic or administrative skills to govern effectively. Joseph's imposition on Spain, for instance, triggered deep resistance and guerrilla conflict. The myth glosses this as a necessary civilizing mission. The reality is messy. Family appointments secured loyalty and power, but also sowed resentment and long-term instability. Propaganda worked hand in glove with governance. Official portraits were not simple flattery. They were tools of statecraft. Commissions to artists like Jacques-Louis David did more than decorate halls. They created an iconography. Paintings of Napoleon astride a rearing horse, crossing the Alps, or hand on chest, blended ancient symbolism with modern spectacle. The iconography borrowed from imperial Rome and medieval legends. It intentionally placed Napoleon in a lineage of empire. These images, multiplied in prints and disseminated widely, shaped perception. Control of information was another layer. Repression of presses, censorship of reports, and manipulation of bulletins were institutionalized. Books and newspapers that did not fit the narrative found themselves suppressed. Messages were curated and amplified. The myth was not merely aspirational, it was engineered. This orchestration began during his rule and continued after his fall, when memoirs and sanitized accounts crystallized a palatable legend. Yet paradoxically, caricature and satire circulated widely in enemy countries. British cartoons mocked his stature and turned personal traits into political weapons. The physical short man trope became a metaphor for an overreaching ambition cramped by personal insecurity. The cartoons were crude, but they stuck. They influenced how foreign publics remembered him. Official French reaction to ridiculed decrees. Punitive measures revealed a sensitivity that cuts against the heroic self-image. A leader who silenced dissent at home but fretted over satirical sketches abroad shows the fragility beneath the public posture. Why does the sanitized version persist? Because it suits narratives of continuity and pride. Nations choose heroes to explain themselves. For France, a figure who combined meritocratic rise with strong government and modernizing reforms served as a national story that reconciled revolution and order. For historians of later centuries, the romantic appeal of a tragic hero gave material for literature and art. And for political actors, The figure could be instrumentalized to justify centralization and authority. But there is more. If you find this line of inquiry valuable, consider subscribing. This channel is small, and every new viewer helps fund deeper dives into the histories your school skipped. Your subscription helps us keep opening files and asking uncomfortable questions. When the tidy narrative begins to fray, it does so along precise fault lines. The earliest cracks are not dramatic revelations, but small dissonances that refuse to be smoothed away. Taken together, they reshape what seems evident. To expose those early fissures, the method is simple. Compare claim to record, speech to act, portrait to ledger. The contradictions pile up in patterns. Each one by itself could be dismissed as nuance. Add them together, and the official story looks like a crafted product. Start with language and identity. The official rendition paints Napoleon as a native son of France, a leader inseparable from the revolutionary nation. The documents tell a different preface. Born in Ajaccio, Corsica, in 1769, he was raised in a region recently transferred from Genoese to French control. Corsican culture in that period was Italianate language, custom, even legal traditions aligned with Italian norms. Young Napoleon wrote in Italian. He learned French at school. He never lost his accent. Why does this matter? Because it situates him as an outsider who rose by integrating into a new political center. It is a detail the myth minimizes because it complicates the tale of seamless national self-creation. Next, the issue of slavery shows a clear moral collision. The revolution abolished slavery in French colonies in 1794, an extraordinary and radical act. The myth of revolutionary ideals often holds this as evidence of universalist commitments. Yet, in 1802, Napoleon re-established slavery in the colonies. Examining decrees and correspondence, historians find practical motives: pressure from colonial planters, economic calculations about sugar production, imperial competition. The reintroduction was rationalized as restoring order and property rights. Those arguments were legalistic, not humanitarian. For thousands, it meant a revocation of freedom already gained. The official narrative rarely centers those victims. Consider the mechanics of political assent. The meritocracy line is convenient. A man of ability rises in a time of revolution. It is true that Napoleon benefited from chaotic social mobility, but he also cultivated networks. Marriage to Josephine, a widow with connections in Parisian society, smoothed certain doors. He relied on patrons, made deals with nobles when it served him, and used family ties as political currency. Merit played a role. Patronage and manipulation did too. The myth prefers merit. Reality discloses mixture. Military statistics add more fissures. In popular accounts, Napoleonic victories tower over defeats. But battle records, casualty lists, and campaign diaries paint a less triumphant mosaic. He won spectacular battles. Yes, he also accepted high attrition. He committed troops to risky flanking maneuvers, gambled on speed in ways that exposed men to starvation and exposure. A tally of engagements shows a career with many setbacks and retreats, not an uninterrupted conquest. The human cost is written in columns of names and graves. The myth keeps those columns offstage. Another category is administrative repression. The image of the modernizing reformer overlays a reality of surveillance and police structures. After 1799, state machinery included a network of secret police, censorship boards, and dossiers on citizens. The Minister of Police, the infamous Fouché, and his successors maintained files that could be leveraged to intimidate or remove opponents. Freedom of the press contracted. Trials and detentions followed. The myth of progressive reform obscures the regime's very modern habit, using administrative capacity to entrench power and eliminate dissent. Art and image making provide a third axis of contradiction. Public statues and canvases show Napoleon as classical hero. The production of such imagery was not spontaneous adoration, but strategic icon building. Artists received commissions with precise instructions. Scenes were staged. Consider the famous crossing of the Alps. Painted horses, wind-blown capes, sweeping vistas that suggest romantic epic. Contemporary mounted logs, however, describe a practical mule and a less theatrical crossing. The discrepancy between image and event is not accidental. It is deliberate construction. When one examines primary sources, letters, military communiques, police memoranda, colonial petitions, patterns emerge. There is a habit of framing unpleasant realities in administratively palatable language. Order restored, discipline enforced, property rights protected. The rhetorical packaging masks coercion. It also reveals a political logic. To govern widely requires narratives that justify coercion as necessity. The more dramatic the imagination, the easier it is to launder consequences. A second group of fishers concerns omissions. Who disappears from the official story? Enslaved persons returned to bondage. Rural populations resisting conscription. Collaborators and local elites whose compromises made governance possible. The myth spotlights the leader and the polity. It tends to elide the people whose lives were transformed into statistics. Letters in colonial archives, petitions from conscripted soldiers' families, and local chronicles often survive in footnotes. When pieced together, they suggest the social costs of grand decisions. The third series of cracks concerns the retelling after his exile. Even the post-1815 reconstruction of his memory is revealing. On St. Helena, he dictated memoirs that cast him in a particular light. Those memoirs were not neutral. They were a remediation, an attempt to control posterity's framing. Publishers, editors, sympathetic biographers, and later romantic writers amplified selected themes. The result is a narrative with its own momentum. The texts that most readers saw were authored, edited, and repackaged to serve rehabilitation. This curating of memory extended across generations. The 19th century Romantic movement found in Napoleon the tragic figure it loved, a singular will, grandeur, fall. Writers like Victor Hugo and Lord Byron contributed to an aesthetic that venerated the singular hero. Politics and art danced together. Later regimes, Napoleon III's Second Empire and the Third Republic, selectively invoked Napoleonic elements to serve national projects. Tourism and museums further fossilized popular images. The past got a convenient gloss. But what about competing narratives? They existed contemporaneously. British pamphlets and cartoons painted him monstrous or comical. Spanish guerrilla accounts documented brutality and resistance. Colonial records protested the re-enslavement of people. Those narratives circulated unevenly. Power decides whose version gets institutionalized. The myth survives not because it was wholly accurate, but because it was convenient for the institutions that outlived him. So what do these cracks mean for us today? They change the terms of judgment. If you admire the Civil Code for its contributions, you can still acknowledge the human price of the policies that enacted it. If you recognize military genius, you can hold it accountable to the standards of proportionality and necessity. Understanding the early fishers reframes admiration as critical engagement. It also changes how we look at monuments and curricula. A statue is not merely honorific. It is a compression of history into a symbol. School lessons that praise without context teach a habit of selective memory. The fishers invite a more nuanced pedagogy, one that holds achievements and crimes in tension, that recognizes both technical accomplishment and moral cost. Finally, the fishers force a political question about the construction of memory. Who benefits from a heroic founding myth? National identity, tourism, state legitimacy, and cultural industries all draw profit. That is why myths persist and why they invite scrutiny. The questions are not purely academic. They affect how societies justify present policies and what they forgive in powerful leaders. These early fissures do not cancel Napoleon's imprint on institutions, law, and war. They complicate it. They demand that we stop treating history as moral. He has been reading reports all day, casualty lists, requisition orders, letters from governors in the colonies, and the pile on his desk never seems to shrink. A valet enters, carrying a single sheet, a caricature copied from a British satirical print. The change in his expression is immediate, disproportionate. He tears the paper and throws it into the fire. His voice, usually measured in public, becomes sharp. He summons a minister. Within hours, the police are instructed to identify the printer. This is not an isolated temper. It is a pattern. Anger functions as policy. Courtiers learned quickly what behaviors tighten the mesh of favor. Loyalty meant more than agreement. It meant anticipating his needs, absorbing his moods, disguising inconvenient facts. Officers were praised in proclamations and punished in private. A general who failed to seize a town at the hour ordered could find himself demoted, his name quietly excised from lists of honors. Ministers guarded their positions with the same ferocity they defended their families' estates. One misstep, one sarcastic reply in a salon, and dossiers compiled by the police might be used to remove you. The Duque de Otranto, Fouché's predecessor, often invoked in later accounts, did not merely collect gossip. His office assembled what looked, in modern terms, like dossiers, compilations of vulnerabilities used as political leverage. Imagine the cupboard with ledgers, each page a life made negotiable. Napoleon's relationships were part performance and part ledger. The story most told of destiny and romantic devotion to Josephine has a hue of truth, but misses the bookkeeping. He loved her, according to many of his letters, in a language that wavered between passion and proprietorship. He demanded accounts of her guests, of her expenses, of her feelings. When suspicion entered, he converted intimacy into surveillance. Letters were read, messages intercepted, confidants questioned. Yet love and calculation were two threads often woven together. Josephine's inability to give him a male heir provided a political justification for a divorce that would consolidate alliances. Marriage and separation used as instruments of statecraft. The intimate thus became administrative. If marriage could serve power, so could sex. Napoleon's affairs functioned in multiple registers. They were personal, but they were also social currency. A mistress in a provincial capital could be an informal ambassador. A liaison in a capital city might open doors to information networks. Soldiers in camp whispered about which officers used intimacy to secure promotions. Governors traded favors for access to the imperial bedroom. These arrangements were not secret in the way a single scandal would suggest. They were structural. The empire's intimate economy mirrored its fiscal one. Favors circulated, obligations accrued, loyalty was bought and recorded. Family was another territory where private sentiment collapsed into political instrument. Napoleon's strategy of installing siblings on thrones read like dynastic theatricality. He did not merely reward kin. He created a family government, a distributed monarchy under his symbolic center. Siblings became administrators of satellite courts, expected to embody imperial policy while deriving their legitimacy from him. But the scene was often awkward. Joseph Bonaparte, appointed king of Naples and later of Spain, arrived in places where language and custom were alien to him. Visualize Joseph in Madrid, standing in a throne room, while murmurs circulate in Spanish about the new foreign king who does not speak their tongue. The imposition sparked violent resistance. Guerrillas, neighborhood committees, and clerical denunciations did not rise because of ideology alone. They rose because governance was attempted through theatrical transplant rather than through local accommodation. This nepotism had a blunt logic. Appointing kin secured trust and reduced the need to police allies who might otherwise seek independent power. But it also revealed insecurity. A ruler who could not find legitimate, experienced administrators trusted family over expertise. That insecurity also shaped how decisions were justified in the public language of reforms. When Joseph's government faltered, central edicts came from Paris framed as neutral rationalization, restructuring to standardize laws, to import administrative order. The lived reality in Spanish towns was the reverse. Local elites ousted, customs disrupted, taxes enforced by outsiders. The veneer of modernizing reform often masked a simpler objective, the consolidation of imperial control. Within the palace network, fear was a quiet currency. Ministers and marshals spoke in careful sentences in Napoleon's presence, measuring tones as one would measure the distance to a precipice. Anecdotes from aides make clear the psychological mechanism. A misread count of troops, a delayed dispatch, even a too honest appraisal of a battlefield could bring humiliation or worse. Executions and reassignments punctuated the administrative life. Those who threatened to become liabilities, whether through incompetence or through accruing independent loyalty, were sidelined. The system operated less on ideology than on an intense calculus of risk management. Napoleon's attention to image extended beyond portraits into dress, ceremony, and physical staging. Uniforms were designed to sculpt presence. Epaulets augmented shoulders. Boots and cut of coat emphasized vertical lines. For a man conscious of comparative stature, the costume was an engineering exercise. Public entrances were choreographed lighting, processions, music, so that distance, foreshortening, and gesture combined to compensate for physical smallness. The crossing of the Alps, in particular, was remade in paint into a mythic tableau, a rearing horse, wind-swept cloak, stern gaze. The real crossing? A mule, a careful walk, a more prosaic logistical feat. The difference matters because the painter's canvas did more than flatter. It told a story that would circulate to places where witnesses never traveled. Artists were not merely flattery machines. They were collaborators in a state ritual. Commissions came with instructions about posture, symbolism, and background detail. Victory scenes needed classical references, Roman laurels, imperial stances to tie the new regime into a lineage of empire. The visual archive thus functioned as a narrative grafting, Napoleonic power sewing itself onto earlier imperial memories. The state's purchase of art was an investment in institutional memory. At the same time, the machinery of surveillance ran in parallel. Police networks interrogated travelers, censored publications, and maintained lists of suspect correspondence. A minister could not assume the loyalty of a provincial official. Dossiers might reveal compromise or sympathy for opposition causes. Spies and informants transmitted not just raw intelligence, but also a sense of constant visibility. Imagine a cafe in Lyon where a local politician speaks cautiously, aware that a waiter might be obliged to report a phrase overheard. The climate of suspicion is the social texture of governance, a slow erosion of trust that shifts relationships from voluntary allegiance to enforced compliance. This web of control extended overseas. Colonial administration combined pragmatic extraction with political theater. Governors reported sugar yields and military readiness, but they also lobbied for the restoration of social orders that benefited planters. Napoleon's decision to reintroduce slavery in 1802 after its revolutionary abolition was not merely administrative reversal. It was an act that responded to specific economic pressures and lobbying from colonial elites. Letters survive from colonial planters pleading for reinstatement. Policy followed. For thousands of men, women, and children, the legal document was the instrument of dispossession and the mechanism of violent return to bondage. In the palace, officials framed this as order and property rights. In the fields, it was brutality re-rationalized in the language of law. There is a rhythm to these backstage scenes. Private anxieties lead to public decrees. Public rituals conceal private compromises. Art and policy collaborate to make absence appear as presence. What the portraits sought to erase, anger, surveillance, transactional intimacy remained part of what government actually was. And this invisible architecture would be laid bare in ways that no studio portrait could capture. Napoleon, who had long associated success with decisive, rapid motion, viewed a retreat from continental influence as an intolerable challenge to his political mastery. The narrative at his desk often reduced strategic complexities to a measure of will, a theater in which to stage inevitability. In private, he told marshals that a summer campaign will suffice, a sentence revealing more of temperament than tactical prudence. From the soldier's point of view, the march was a study in progressive deprivation. The first weeks brought disorder through supply. Wagons overloaded, roads turned to mud by rains, horses collapsing under strain. Local requisition proved inadequate in a scorched and defended countryside. The Russian strategy of scorched earth compounded the problem. Villages burned ahead of the French columns. Grazing was gone. Food caches were destroyed. The air smelled not of smoke from campfires, but of charred harvests, the deliberate destruction of the resource base. For infantrymen, the terrain was now an enemy as lethal as enemy troops. Tactical moments revealed deeper strategic fault lines. Napoleon's insistence on occupying urban centers like Smolensk and Moscow relied on the assumption that victory could be secured by seizing symbolic capitals. That assumption conflated psychological triumph with sustainable conquest. The Russian command refused to stand for annihilation. They withdrew orderly, trading space for time, inviting supply breakdowns to do the work of attrition. When French armies finally reached Moscow, the city that the emperor expected as a capitulation stage was already aflame. Its fires, whether set by retreating Russians or catastrophic accident, destroyed stores, munitions, and the possibility of winter quarters. Napoleon's arrival into a city without resources transformed a potential triumph into an operational dead end. The cold escalated with a cruelty that turned bodies into artifacts. Temperatures dropped. Frostbitten limbs became a new record kept on nightly lists. Horses, invaluable for cavalry and transportation, collapsed and were killed for food in a grim arithmetic. Medical care, rudimentary to begin with, could not handle the flood of gangrenous wounds and frostbite. Imagine a makeshift shelter of tarpaulin where men lie bundled, faces waxy, teeth chattering, doctors working by lamplight. Desperation in every movement. Supply wagons drawn by exhausted teams already stretched, now fewer could not keep pace. Discipline frayed. Desertion, once rare in an army formed on loyalty and myth, rose as survival instinct overcame oath. Where responsibility should be taken, something else occurred: rationalization. Official communiques turned catastrophe into narrative artifact. Bulletins spoke of strategic repositioning and promised imminent recovery. In Paris salons, gray lines in newspapers reassured a public eager to sustain the image of infallibility. But the ledger of human life told another story. Contemporary calculations estimate that of the roughly 600,000 men who entered Russia, perhaps 30,000 would return as functioning soldiers. The rest died in battle, from disease, from exposure, or were captured. The scale is difficult to grasp. Consider a city the size of a mid-sized capital emptied of its male population. Consider towns where entire cohorts never returned, bottom lines on family ledgers for decades. For communities across Europe, the loss was not an abstract statistic but a permanent demographic rupture. Napoleon's personal response to this unfolding catastrophe complicates the moral geography. In many accounts, he is the commander-in-chief who shares danger with his men. In others, he retreats into a different logic. As the crisis deepened, he left for Paris, an action judged by contemporaries as pragmatic distance and by critics as abdication of command. The moral question becomes pressing. When a leader departs a failing theater, does tactical oversight justify physical removal, or is presence itself a form of accountability? Deployments of blame followed. Officers tried to justify choices they could no longer amend. The emperor's departure allowed the machinery of narrative to begin its work, framing disaster as aberration, weather and fate as the protagonists rather than misplanning and arrogance. The immediate aftermath was a political cascade. Governments in Germany, Italy, Spain, nodes in the Napoleonic network began feeling the shock. Conscription increased to replace losses. Youths, barely men, were called to replenish ranks. Fewer than a year after the retreat, another wave of levies swept across jurisdictions, drawing more lives into an imperial system that had proven fragile. Families petitioned governors, wrote letters to officials, sent pleas to local notables. Archives keep the petitions, smudged with tears and ink, small human documents against the sweep of state rhetoric. These are rarely the documents taught in schools. They are the footnotes, the human margins of policy decisions. The Russia campaign did not stand alone. It amplified existing patterns. In Spain, the so-called Peninsular War had bled resources and legitimacy for years. Guerrilla resistance, partisan warfare, and the brutalities of occupation had already transformed the imperial project into a grinding attrition. At Leipzig and later Waterloo, the imperial system showed the limits of political theater. Napoleon's earlier tempo's rapid maneuvers that had overwhelmed opponents could not sustain a prolonged, multi-front conflict. Allies shifted. Coalitions formed with the explicit aim of breaking hegemonic momentum. Strategically, the overreach was catastrophic. Morally, the toll was devastating. Yet how did this man responsible, by design and decision, for policies that consumed lives in the millions become the subject of elegy rather than indictment? Part of the answer lies in how public discourse would later be shaped. Memoirs from St. Helena, edited narratives, and the cultural apparatus of a Europe eager for a tragic icon. But another part is structural. An appetite in European society for myths that reconciled modern administrative achievement with the violence it enabled. People wanted a figure who could embody revolution without its chaos, order without cold instruments. They wanted an architect of law while excusing the cost. That appetite greased the machinery of rehabilitation. Recognition of the human cost complicates any hero's narrative. When one lines the ledger, the lists of conscripted names, the parish registers with missing entries, the columns of wounded sent to improvised hospitals, the spectacle of strategic genius becomes indistinct from a bureaucracy of death. Histories that honor institutional reforms must then answer, what price was paid and to whose benefit? That question, raw and immediate after Russia, aimed at the heart of the regime and would not be fully answered by memoirs and monuments. Instead, a new industry began, the industry of shaping the memory that would smooth the jagged edges of accountability. That effort would be systematic, creative, and relentless. The political theater that followed Russia did more than rewrite events. It recast the very language by which citizens would evaluate authority. The state's ability to control press and patronize arts turned failure into an elegy for greatness. The next movement in this story is not a battle, but a volume of paintings, bulletins, and edited memoirs. The construction of a legend that would obscure the ledger of deaths. How does a losing campaign become the seedbed for a hero myth? The answer lies in the next act, the deliberate production of image and text that would outlast corpses and petitions. Propaganda is often thought of as crude posters and overt lies. In Napoleon's case, it operated at a higher register, as calibrated performance, institutional suppression, cultural patronage, and the patient editing of memory. To understand how the man who presided over mass conscription and carnage would become a figure wrapped in heroic drama, follow the threads of symbolic manufacture. Begin with the commissioning of art. Paintings are not mere decoration. They are durable arguments about who matters and why. When Napoleon sat for Jacques Louis David or Edouard de Taille, he was not choosing vanity. He He was testing how an image could compress complex politics into a single readable sign. Consider Napoleon crossing the Alps. The painting substitutes mule for rearing stallion in the lived truth, but the canvas offers a story the public could internalize. The Arc de Triomphe was not mere infrastructure. It was a permanent rehearsal for reverence. Such symbols functioned as mnemonic anchors. Even when the living memory faded, the stone retained an argument. Monuments act as grammar for civic memory, teaching peoples through architecture what to feel. Memory engineering went further, the production and curation of texts. On St. Helena, in exile, Napoleon dictated memoirs that read as both defense and self-fashioning. These accounts did not simply narrate. They provided a template for future authors, selective, self-exculpatory, woven into a narrative arc of betrayal by enemies and martyrdom by circumstances. Publishers and editors in the 19th century repackaged these traces into accessible biographies. Romantic writers, seizing narrative drama, amplified the tragic dimensions. Victor Hugo and Lord Byron took elements of this framing heroic will, tragic fall, and turned them into cultural currency. Literature does what legislation cannot. It humanizes complexity into archetype. Institutions participated. The Bonapartist revival of the Second Empire and later the Third Republic's selective embrace rooted Napoleon in state ritual and education. School curricula could marshal sanitized versions of his reforms, legal codification, administrative rationalization, without dwelling on the coercive mechanisms that implemented them. Museums, veterans associations, and civic festivals transformed memory into collective habit. In a generation, the image of the reforming modernizer overshadowed the ledger of repression. The film industry would complete what paintings and pamphlets began. In the 20th century, cinematic depictions reduced nuance into leitmotifs. The tragic hero, the romantic lover, the brilliant strategist. Soundtracks amplified pathos. Close-ups humanized decisions. Editing smoothed contradictions. A crucial effect of cinema is empathy through narration. A viewer can be invited to feel alongside the leader while missing the structural violence his regime produced. Tourism and merchandising then commercialized the effect. Souvenir figurines, guided tours of the invalid's tomb, themed museums, and cafes. Memory became commodity, profitable and portable. But propaganda's efficacy depended on complicity at several levels. Intellectuals and historians often preferred a tidy narrative because it served political reconciliation. A nation recovering from multiple regime changes found solace in a figure who seemed to bridge revolutionary rupture and state continuity. Monarchists and Republicans alike could taste in Napoleon the virtues they desired: order, administration, splendor. The myth, once useful, became politically expedient. Propaganda also worked by omission. What was left out of official histories was as telling as what was included. Enslaved peoples, conscripts, peasants, the nameless victims of requisition, these groups rarely received archival notice in celebratory texts. Their records, when preserved, ended up in local notarial files or exile petitions, footnotes to a national story that preferred major characters. The work of rehabilitation required erasure, remove the noise of suffering, emphasize the shine of reform. Museums and curricula refined this labor across decades. There is a small theater piece that demonstrates the technique. Take the events of the Russian campaign and produce two texts. The first is raw, the letters home, casualty lists, petitions, municipal complaints. The second is curated, edited memoirs, triumphant paintings, selective statistics. Present both to the same audience, across different decades, and watch belief shift. Repetition and authority combine. A public hears the curated version more often, from figures of institutional prestige, until it seems default. Yet the production of myth always collides with dissent. Caricatures in Britain remained persistent, virulent, and sometimes grotesque, turning the emperor into a grotesque symbol of overreach. Those cartoons mattered. They fixed alternative readings in popular culture across that island nation. They also, paradoxically, shaped continental memory. Napoleon's reaction to ridicule sensitivity. Censorship fed the narrative of a man who could not tolerate mockery. Propaganda depends on controlling not only content but tone. When adversaries set the tone of ridicule, the mythmakers must respond either with suppression or with softer, more expansive cultural projects. The machinery of myth is not merely external. It reshapes the self-understanding of elites and citizens. Bureaucracies internalize the narrative of efficiency and modernity. Teachers internalize the curriculum. Artists internalize the heroic script. The myth work becomes a collective habit, an interpretive lens through which other events are judged. It is one thing to manipulate a public for immediate gain. It is another to embed an interpretive grammar into institutions so that future interpretation naturally favors the myth. How resilient is such a constructed memory? The answer is mixed. Monuments can be toppled. Films lose currency. New scholarship can excavate uncomfortable records. Still, the infrastructure that supports a myth, schools, state ceremonies, museum collections, tourism economies, tends to be durable. Dismantling a myth requires not only new facts, but alternative narratives that can be taught, felt, and institutionalized. It requires, in short, a political will for re-memory. This reconstruction leaves a paradox. Napoleon's legal and administrative footprints are real. Millions live today under codes and municipal systems he refigured. Yet the moral price remains embedded in the ledger of the past. The genius attributed to him is inseparable from the machinery that produced compliance, the methods that consolidated power, and the costs borne by the powerless. Once we see the craft of myth-making art commissioned, presses closed, memorials erected, memoirs edited, we can no longer accept a single, flattened portrait. The deliberate engineering of image demands an equally deliberate rethinking of legacy. After you have watched the paintings and read the official biographies, a quieter demonstration remains. Open a provincial archive. Look at petitions by families who lost children in conscription lists. Read petitions by colonial inhabitants returned to slavery. Track the administrative memos that rationalize coercion as order. There you will feel the friction between myth and ledger. The next question is not merely who made the myth, but why it was so useful that generations consented to it. Who profited economically, politically, culturally from turning an emperor into an epic and a ledger into a footnote? The answer connects memory to power in ways that still matter today, and it is not a comfortable one. When the varnish is removed, the figure left behind is neither myth nor monster, but a human apparatus of ambition and calculation, a composite of virtues and vices that fit uneasily together. To build a more honest portrait of Napoleon is to accept contradictions as the frame, not as damage to be hidden. He is at once brilliant and reckless, administrative and authoritarian, charismatic and compulsive. The task here is to map those contradictions across 4 axes people can hold in their head: character, objectives, methods, and impact. For each axis, we will quickly recall the comforting story you were told, lay out the messy records and testimonies that complicate that story, and then offer a grounded and uncomfortable synthesis that refuses to flatten complexity into legend. Character. The textbooks give you a silhouette, a heroic, decisive leader. In paintings, he is solitary on a rearing horse, destiny in his gaze. The reality in dispatches, letters, and private journals is more jagged. Witnesses speak of impatience that turned to fury, aides scrawling notes as he shredded a report, officers flinching when a phrase displeased him. He could charm a minister into desperate loyalty in the morning and dismiss him with humiliating cruelty by evening. At the same time, those closest to him recorded moments of genuine curiosity, of sustained attention to legal minutiae, of an almost obsessive delight in practical reforms. The same man who ordered mass conscriptions also obsessed over the text of an ordinance about municipal boundaries. This duality suggests a temperament dominated by so the honest reading is that his objectives were layered. There were real projects of modernization that produced public goods. There was also a persistent objective to construct a resilient base of power. Institutions that would outlast him, networks of loyal officials, a legal architecture that made the center legible and, therefore, dominant. The same reform that rationalized taxation also made it easier to extract troops and money. The two aims are not mutually exclusive, they are entangled. The result: real improvements for administration coincident with real costs to local autonomy and personal freedoms. Methods. In the glossy story, methods are tactical brilliance, speed of movement, exemplary leadership. The evidence complicates that. His military planning was often improvisational and reliant on audacity. He took risks his marshals warned against. His campaigns reveal a pattern of gambits that worked when logistics, seasons, and luck aligned, and failed spectacularly when they did not. Look at the winter campaign in Russia. You see audacity that became catastrophe, and under the same ledger you read the orders that display a brittle confidence bordering on denial. There were also darker methods: systematic censorship, a police apparatus that hoarded dossiers as leverage, and the instrumental use of family as administrators irrespective of competence. The instruments of power he employed were both classical and modern. He used spoils, promotions, titles, and legal instruments to bind elites to him. He used propaganda art, engineered bulletins, public ceremonies to create an interpretive frame around events. He perfected a mixed toolkit: bureaucratic rationality maps, codes, prefects combined with theatrical politics arches, parades, portraits. That hybrid method yielded astonishing capacity. It also institutionalized subordination. When a society's incentives are retooled to reward proximity to a single center, meritocracy becomes a mirror image of clientelism. Impact. This axis is the hardest to feel honestly because its measures sprawl across generations. There are immediate, concrete effects: wars, conscriptions, death counts, legal texts. There are diffuse, long-term consequences: administrative models adopted by others, legal principles embedded into civil systems, cultural tropes that valorize strong executives. Measuring impact means holding both registers at once: the policy footprint and the moral ledger. On the positive side, his legal and administrative legacies endure. The Civil Code provided predictable property and contract rules. Prefectures created mechanisms for public order and infrastructure. These made commerce and modern governance more feasible in fragmented polities. On the other side, the social cost was enormous. Millions were mobilized, often coerced, to wage wars of expansion. Colonies saw repression and the re-imposition of slavery. Dissidents were surveilled, exiled, or silenced. The administrative machine normalized mass mobilization and the concentration of executive power in ways that later regimes would emulate. The balance sheet is therefore stubbornly ambiguous. Institutional modernity built atop social violence. Beyond the axis, psychology and symbol. A complete portrait must pay attention to symbols. He deliberately curated the uniform, the hand and waistcoat pose, the classical references, and to the psychological work he never stopped doing. He was constantly purchasing and commissioning images, rewriting memoirs, editing bulletins. This is not mere vanity. It is the active construction of a narrative environment in which his decisions would appear not only competent but necessary, part of a moral and historical arc. When you study the way he edited his own memoirs and how friendly publishers amplified them, you are not merely watching self-promotion. You are watching the architecture of a second front, memory. One important caution: where historians disagree, we must mark the difference. There is dispute over his motives in particular cases, whether certain colonial policies were pragmatic fiscal measures or ideologically consistent lapses into racial hierarchy. There is debate about the degree to which his early revolutionary fervor ever became genuine belief rather than instrument. The portrait I offer here tries to respect those disputes. Where consensus is strong, treat it as foundation. Where evidence pulls different ways, present the plausible range and the stakes of each interpretation. What should stick with you after this reconstruction is a clean discomfort. Napoleon was not a singularity of pure genius. He was a human operator who used modern tools to extraordinary effect and whose psychological needs pushed him repeatedly toward violent solutions. He left behind institutions many still depend on. He also left behind methods of governance that made tyranny efficient. Recognizing both admiring administrative achievements while refusing sentimental forgiveness for the human cost is the only honest stance. That tension will follow us when we trace how the story about him was rewritten and packaged for future audiences. There is one more trap to avoid, turning moral complexity into moral equivalence. Admiration for legal order does not erase responsibility for deliberate political choices that brutalized people. The portrait must carry both truths together. And yet the story does not stop at character and policy. It extends outward into memory. Who tells the tale, with what emphasis, and what is deliberately edited away? That editing is how a controversial leader transmutes into a symbolic anchor for later regimes. The next part of our investigation asks, how exactly did that transformation happen? Who held the scalpel that carved Napoleon into a hero and who buried the ledger of loss? Imagine a montage running like a film reel across a lifetime. A painter's brush stroking a general into Caesar, a censor's hand clipping an inconvenient dispatch, a romantic poet elevating a fallen emperor into tragic star, a school inspector signing off on a chapter that eulogizes reforms and omits requisitions. This is the machinery of memory making an action. To understand the present after the campaign, you must see the process by which public record became curated myth. The work operates in three registers: political/social, religious/ideological, and culture/market, and each register uses overlapping tools: art, law, education, media, ritual, and eventually entertainment. Follow the threads, and you will see why monuments feel inevitable and why victims end up in footnotes. Political and social instruments. Start with the state itself. After a catastrophe like the Russian campaign, the immediate need for damage control is practical. How does a regime avoid collapse? The answer is to centralize narratives. Once the immediate crisis subsides, the apparatus that survived the campaign ministries, veterans associations, loyal prefects begins the steady work of reinterpretation. Official bulletins shift lexicon. Strategic repositioning replaces retreat. Heroic sacrifices replaces failed logistics. These are not accidental euphemisms. Language maps public perception. A government that can translate operational failure into noble suffering buys time to rebuild material capacity and reframe moral culpability. But there is a second, more subtle operation. The same institutions that centralized military and administrative power begin to institutionalize remembrance. Archives are curated. Certain documents are restricted. Others are published with carefully chosen prefaces. Veterans' pensions and commemorative rituals become mechanisms of inclusion. If you are part of the memory, you are eligible for recognition. If you are not part of it, peasant conscripts, colonial subjects, the families of the captured, your losses are less likely to be counted in national narratives. The social consequence is consolidation. Veterans, civil servants, and town officials become stakeholders in a sanitized story because they materially benefit. Religious and ideological adaptation. Churches and ideological movements also play a role. Where the state needs additional moral scaffolding, religious institutions can offer it. Clergy who had been ambivalent about revolutionary projects found ways to align Napoleon's stabilizing role with spiritual restoration, order as moral good, empire as providential. Sermons began to adopt images that framed the emperor as a force against chaos. Once an aesthetic settles, it influences how future chroniclers imagine events and how schoolbooks illustrate turns of history. The printed press was shaped by closure and favor. When some publishers earned access or contracts, dissenting pamphlets were suppressed. The result was uneven discourse. Over time, a comfortable narrative grew dominant. Napoleonic reforms were rational. Defeats were bad weather. The emperor was tragic but morally grand. This narrative then fed cultural entrepreneurs, playwrights, novelists, and later filmmakers who found dramatic gold in a fallen, misunderstood genius. Romantic poets found the tragic arc irresistible. They heightened emotional registers and, in doing so, sanctified the individual at the expense of systemic critique. A key piece of this cultural economy was the market's appetite. Museums, monuments, and tourism monetized myth. A tomb in an ornate setting became not just memorial but destination. The state and private promoters built circuits. The map of memory became a map of revenue. Cultural curation is now part of municipal budgets. Local economies learn to benefit from the myth. If you run a town near a site associated with the empire, it is costly to emphasize suffering or repression. Economies cohere around a narrative, and narratives that sustain livelihoods are sticky. The technique of erasure. One of the most effective moves in memory building is omission. Not every archive is destroyed. Often the power is in what is left unpublished. Municipal petitions, rural complaints, letters from conscripts' families, these documents exist in provincial records, but they never made it into the curated set of sources that editors later used to write national histories. That absence is not accidental. The bureaucratic apparatus controlled access. When you trace poetry turned into policy and policy into curricula, you will notice that omissions correspond closely to interests. When the ledger of suffering challenged the legitimacy of conscription, those lists were localized and kept out of national anthologies. The long tail of reinvention. The reshaping did not stop with immediate post-war narratives. Subsequent regimes found Napoleon's image adaptable. Monarchists could emphasize order. Republicans could emphasize reform. Imperialists could emphasize glory. Each group selected the version most compatible with their projects. The real triumph of the narrative engineers was hybridity. They left a figure flexible enough to be claimed by multiple political languages. That adaptability made the myth durable. Media technology multiplied the effects across the centuries. In the 19th century, engravings and novels. In the 20th, cinema. In the 21st, games and tourism. Each medium accentuated different parts of the narrative. Film privileged intimate psychology and spectacle. Video games made campaigns into playable strategies, often sacrificing context and human cost for mechanics. The cumulative effect is astonishing. In a culture saturated with certain images and emotional frames, a person can be familiar with the hero without the ledger of costs. You saw how propaganda works as a system. Image commissioned, press shaped, monument erected, curriculum edited, literary tradition cultivated, cultural economy formed. But who benefits? Governments gain legitimacy. Elites gain nobility of memoir. The cultural industry gains revenue. Historians sympathetic to the center gain careers on a tidy narrative. The further advantage is political reconciliation. In a nation with revolutions, restorations, and crowns, a myth that fuses order and progress provides comforting cohesion. That solidarity is politically expedient. It smooths over responsibility. Breaking the myth. How do you dismantle something so well built? The first step is archival excavation. Provincial records, petitions, parish registers, hospital lists contain voices that were excluded. When researchers stitch them into comparative studies, the scale of losses and the texture of suffering become visible. The second is pedagogical revision. Textbooks can be rewritten to include multiple registers of evidence. The third is cultural reimagination. Films, novels, and games can be encouraged to foreground perspectives of conscripts, colonized peoples, and the families left behind. But dismantling is never just about correction. It is about building new narratives that feel as compelling as the old. The myth succeeded because it was dramatic, cinematic, and emotionally satisfying. A sober correction risks feeling dry unless it is woven into vivid stories. The letter of a widow, the map of a lost village, the ledger of a municipal clerk. These small human scenes are the raw material of a new popular memory that does not require hagiography to be gripping. One concrete example, compare two museum rooms. In the first, polished uniforms gleam beneath spotlights. Maps describe troop movements. Victory is lit as inevitable. In the second, the lights are subdued. There is a wooden cot with a torn blanket, a letter pinned to the wall, a parish register half-burned. The map includes not only troop lines but the names of villages requisitioned for food and the petitions written that never reached Paris. The first comforts, the second unsettles. Both teach, which will anchor communal memory. Even as you consider these layers, ask a harder question. What other mythic figures in our present-day politics have benefited from the same mix of state power, cultural industry, and economic interest? When you notice the pattern, the work to correct it moves from historical curiosity to civic responsibility. There is also an irony that keeps returning. The very modernizing mechanisms he built, efficient bureaucracy, legal codification, centralized education, were the mechanisms used later to reproduce the myth. The bureaucratic state that made authoritarianism effective also made heroic narratives coherent and transmissible. That tautology is uncomfortable. The instruments of rationality are the instruments of erasure when turned towards selective memory. If you have followed this far, you should feel the old hero shimmering and also the fingerprints of editing on his shine. The myth was not an accident, it was engineered. And the engineering continues in new media. That realization should not only unsettle you, it should make the case for active, ongoing archival work and for popular media that refuses simple consolation. There is a last, immediate consequence to this story. Once a myth is built into institutions, it resists change. Curricula need to be revised. Museums must accept discomfort. Tourists must be invited to see more than spectacle. This is slow political work, but it is also the only way that a society can reckon honestly with the effects of a powerful man's choices and with the cost that modernity sometimes asks of the powerless. The next step is necessary and small. Tighten your attention to the human documents, to the petitions, to those diaries kept by hand in provincial drawers. Only by amplifying those voices can the ledger be balanced. What comes after balancing is a question for citizens and for the cultural economy. What stories will we choose to elevate? You began with a single image, a small man furious at a caricature. You followed campaigns of fire and cold, bureaucratic memos and burned villages, and you watched how brushstrokes and press cuts turned disaster into legend. The through line is simple and grave. Power is not only exercised in battlefields and decrees, it is exercised in memory. Who writes the story decides which lives count. So here is the question that must remain with you. When a society accepts a polished hero made by careful omission, what other injustices have been smoothed into footnotes? If the past we inherit is already edited, who watches the editors now? Thank you for following this investigation to the end. If this piece unsettled you, subscribe not for spectacle, but to keep asking the uncomfortable questions that history's brightest stones often try to obscure. Tell us in the comments, where did you first learn the heroic version, and what forgotten ledger would you like to see open next? The files are many. The work of rereading has only begun.